Hi guys, you're going to be watching Hamlet this week, and so I wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you about what Shakespeare's theater was like. There are two events that define England during the period that we would know as the Renaissance. The first has to do with the gentleman in the picture, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth's father. Now, many of you might know that Henry was married to six different wives. That was the famous TV miniseries, The Six Wives of Henry VIII. Henry's appetites for women, as well as food and wine and just life in general, gave birth to one of the defining events of this period, and that was the break with the Roman Catholic Church. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, the sister to the King of Spain. But the marriage was producing no male heir. And so Henry was desperate to find someone who would give him a male heir to continue his line, the Tudor line. And so he fell in love with a woman named Anne Boleyn. He asked the Pope to grant a divorce to allow him to marry Anne. The Pope refused. And as arrogant people so often will, Henry came up with his own solution. He broke from the Roman Catholic Church, said that Rome had no authority over England, and created the Church of England, of which he was the head. He therefore granted himself the divorce and was able to marry Anne Boleyn. Their first child, their only child, was Elizabeth, who would later become Queen of England. It would be many years before England was solidly Protestant. Henry died and was followed in short reigns by his sickly son and by another relative, but eventually he was succeeded by the child he had with Catherine of Aragon, that daughter, Mary. She was also often referred to as Bloody Mary because of all of the martyrs, the executions she did to people who had sworn allegiance to Henry's church and now refused to go back to the Roman Church that she was trying to reinstate. When Elizabeth came to the throne after Mary's death from cancer, she took England back into Protestantism, back to the Church of England, and it stayed there basically for the rest of English history. But it was still a shaky time. And so this religious turmoil and this aversion to religious themes in art and in plays because of the controversy was one of the things that led to the development of drama in Elizabeth's reign, and specifically to the great playwrights like Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. The other great event of this era, the defining event, was the eventual defeat of the Spanish under Elizabeth I. Elizabeth came to the throne about 1558, and she would rule until her death in 1603. Now, during that time, she was known as the Virgin Queen because she never took a consort. She never married. And there were many who vied for her hand. Many people who thought if we can marry Elizabeth and get England on our side, we can create great empire. One of the countries that always attempted to link with England in this way was the country of Spain. Now, Spain during this era is the great world power. Their navies have been to the New World. They have their colonies in America that are producing gold and silver through the mines that are being operated by the slave labor of the native population they found there. Elizabeth resisted this. And so in the 1580s, war with Spain finally broke out. That war culminated in what was called the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Spain sent the greatest navy that had ever been assembled to this point to England. At this point, England was not considered a maritime power. Spain was the great naval power of the world. And so this huge fleet of Spanish warships comes against the little island kingdom of England, who has nothing but tiny little raiding ships. But because of the size of the Spanish ships and their unwieldy nature in the waters of the English Channel, and weather that made those conditions even worse, those small raiding ships of the English were able to rip apart the Spanish Armada, and that defeat of the Spanish made England the new maritime world power, and there was this great outpouring of pride and exaltation at being English. You saw a great spike in English trade. You saw a great upturn in England's view of herself as the leader of the modern world. And we see a great growth and change in the art and literature of England during this period. And one of the great things that comes out of it are the plays, the theater that develops during this era. Now, there are two great playwrights of this era. The first is Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was said to be a better poet than Shakespeare was, and many believe that if he had lived, he would be considered the great playwright of this era. However, he died in a barroom brawl after only leaving 5 or 6 well-known scripts. He was Shakespeare's predecessor. Although they were contemporaries, he began his career shortly before Shakespeare began his. Shakespeare begins to appear on the English stage in the late 1580s, about the time of the Spanish Armada. His great dramas date from about 1591-92 with Romeo and Juliet up until his death in 1616. Shakespeare, it was noted for his character development, for his poetry, for his use of language. He becomes the great stage persona of his era. 38 plays during his career. Many of those are typically divided into the categories of history, tragedy, and comedy. Many of those plays would be lost to us, but due to the copyright laws of that era, there were no copyright laws. And so theaters tried to keep their plays from being published. Once a play was published, there was nothing to keep another theater from producing that same play. And so it was known that publishers would send spies to the theater to sit there and try to write down as much of the dialogue as they could during the performance, and then they would publish these pirated versions of the plays. Luckily, in 1623, many of Shakespeare's friends came together and decided to publish a collection of his plays that were authorized scripts. This edition of the Shakespeare plays became known as the First Folio. And if it wasn't for the First Folio, many of Shakespeare's plays would have been lost. Macbeth, one of perhaps the greatest tragedies of Shakespeare's writing, would have been lost completely because we wouldn't have had an edition of it. So many consider the First Folio the authoritative edition of the Shakespeare plays. And if you're looking for the most accurate transcription of the scripts, that's where you go. A little bit about the physical theater structures that Shakespeare's plays are performed in. Much is made of the public theaters of Shakespeare's day, and this is where most of his plays would have been presented. These were theaters that were largely out of doors. They were round buildings with a huge open space to allow light in, because that was the only way that they could light the performances. So all of these plays took place during the day. The public theaters of Shakespeare's day were huge structures that could seat hundreds. And the audiences were basically dealt with in two categories. There was a very large open area on the ground level around the thrust stage, and this would have been the area for the groundlings. They would have paid less, but they would have stood to watch the entire play. And some of Shakespeare's plays could last up to 3 hours, but they would have stood there in the sunlight for 3 hours to watch this play. We know from records that the pit where the groundlings stood was often packed. In addition to the pit, there were galleries around the perimeter of the theater where there was bench seating for those who could afford to pay. And as you would go up higher in the theater, those seats were considered of higher quality. You could also buy cushions to make your seat a little more comfortable. Now, the theater featured a thrust stage that thrust out into the pit where the groundling stood, and the action of the play took place on that thrust stage. There was a hidden area that could be revealed by a curtain at the back of the thrust stage, where things like the discovery of the bodies of Romeo and Juliet occurred. There was also a balcony above the stage that famous scenes like the balcony scene could be presented. The public theaters of Shakespeare's day were only one of the theater possibilities for the theater going public. There was also the private theaters. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that the distinction between public and private is a little different than what it means today. The private theaters were smaller indoor theaters where performances were held at night by candlelight, and they were more expensive. Obviously, if you're paying for the candles, you've got a larger expense there, and the seating was limited, and so it cost more. And so the distinction private and public has more to do with ticket price and availability to the average person rather than membership into some organization. It wasn't private because you weren't allowed in if you didn't have a membership. It was private because you couldn't afford to be there. Now, the private theaters were always occupied by boys' companies. There were adult actors playing in the public theaters. The private theaters would have companies of boys that were governed by an impresario or teacher. Now, one of the most striking conventions of the Shakespearean era was the practice that all women's roles were played by men, just like we saw in the Greek. But this was done without masks in the Elizabethan theater. For romantic roles, for young romantic roles like Juliet, the role was played by a boy whose voice had not yet changed, whose voice was still high. The comic roles, like the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, would have been played by some old bearded man, and that was part of the comedy. Shakespeare was one of the most successful theater artists of his time, and by the time of his death in 1616, he was a well-to-do man with a large estate. Now, first of all, we need to realize that although he was an Elizabethan playwright, Shakespeare continued to write past the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, and so that some of his plays took place under the reign of James I, and so therefore are also Jacobean dramas. In around 1614, he retired and left the theater, but supposedly after a long night of eating and partying with his friends from the theater, his old theater days, he got a fever and died. In his will, he left most of his estate to his daughter, Susanna, but he left to his wife his second best bed, which we can only assume was due to a strained relationship with his wife. The epitaph on his grave reads, "Good friends, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones."